where are we? At Hofstra University today for talk. Hello, we are connected. Hang on one moment. Thank you for being part of today's afternoon. Welcome to the Afternoon Constitutional. My name is Joe Thomas, and on behalf of all of us here at the Government Oversight, or Government Accountability and Oversight Group, thank you for joining in with us and letting us spend a little time with you this afternoon. We're going to begin with something that you may have heard of. There was an issue brewing in Washington regarding the ability of the federal government, or so we were told, to pay their bills. And much was made about it. You may have seen it in all the papers if you still read the papers. And we got to catch up with somebody who had been involved with those kind of negotiations before. And we got a whole bunch of stuff to get into on it. But first, I thought my chat earlier this morning with Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. The last time there was a deal of balancing the budget and the contract with America, I asked him pretty directly, what is your advice to my listeners who are sitting there saying, what just happened to us?
Well, I mean, if they'll look at my new book, March the Majority, they'll see, when we won in '94, we had a big majority, we had a lot of momentum, but we didn't leap to a balanced budget. We had to work for 3 straight years and one step at a time. And I tell people the debt ceiling bill, if it's a first step, is a pretty decent bill. If it's the last step, it's a terrible bill. I happen to think it's the beginning of a process, and I think it was important because it shifted the balance of power in Washington away from the White House and away from the Senate towards the House Republicans. And House Republicans are the most conservative group in the city.
So that was Newt Gingrich from earlier today. He's got a new book out with the March to the Majority, where he's chronicling the whole contract with America period. Now, joining us from Americans for Prosperity, their senior fellow for economics, he is Kurt Couchman. Kurt, thank you so much for taking a little time out with us. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today, Joe?
Well, still trying to wrap my arms around it, and I guess I was almost expecting Speaker Gingrich to take up for Speaker McCarthy, but he warned, and it goes on later in the interview. People can get it on my podcast channel later to tell the listeners and the viewers that you have to keep on these people. You can't just say, "Okay, that's it. All done, time to go home." And so I guess his point being that if this is just the first step in a process, it's good. It's a good first step, but it's not the do-all, end-all. What is your view of it?
The speaker's exactly right. This is hopefully the first step of many to get our country back on the right track. It's about fiscal responsibility, but it's also about economic growth and prosperity and peace, domestically as well as abroad. And we've got a lot of work left to do. This deal did take some steps in the right direction. It changed the course we were on modestly in a couple of different ways. But we've got to keep at it. And AFP, we're a national grassroots organization. We've got a great chapter in Virginia. We are set up to keep this fight going for years and decades to come.
Well, and certainly you have. I mean, we go back to the Tea Party era and 2008, 2009, when we thought that was out of control spending, Kurt. I- for people who might take an election off or say, "Oh, this one's not important," or this should remind us that each one of these elections is a force multiplier to the next one, especially when it comes to the elected officials' attitude towards the tax collections they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Every election matters. And, when people that want freedom and prosperity and all the good things sit out elections, that means that we're going to lose some of those things. So we have to be engaged in every general election. We have to be engaged in every primary election to make sure that good people are able to win and translate those principles into concrete policy.
Well, and it's also, as they say, well said is better, well done is better than well said. A lot of people can say, "Oh, I'm a fiscal conservative," and we've seen this before, where they get to Washington and their idea of fiscal conservatism is just instead of spending 3% more, they spent 2.9% more. I mean, there has to be a reckoning, isn't there, Kurt? I mean, or are we overstating the peril? Continuing to devalue the dollar the way we are.
No, I don't think we're overstating the peril. If we keep going on the course that we're on, we're going to have lower and lower economic growth. At some point, the budget is unsustainable right now, and at some point, we could be experiencing like decades of stagnation, like Japan has been going through for a while now.
Hmm.
Remember, they were supposed to pass us in the 1980s, and that just hasn't been what's happened. And we could experience a fiscal crisis, a debt crisis. And people are like, well, Greece is still around. Well, Greece is relatively small. They got bailed out. There's nobody that can bail out the USA. If we were to get into a debt crisis, it's unpredictable. It could go anywhere from badly to catastrophically for us.
Hmm.
So let's avoid that. Let's get ahead of it.
Well, considering how much of our sovereign debt China owns, maybe we can count on them. They already own a whole bunch of our farmland, Kurt.
I'm not sure I would count on China for a whole lot of good things.
Well, I didn't say good things, but so Kurt, the Massey amendment that got the bill out of the Rules Committee, and we're really, I mean, we are nerd prom central this morning. I mean, this is challenging the watching the paint dry channel for it. But in the Rules Committee, it wasn't even going to make it to the House floor unless they promised Tommy Massey that if any of the budget sections failed to get an affirmative action out of Congress, there was going to be an automatic 1% reduction in those budgets. I don't think for a minute, knowing that they could lose 1% of anything that they want to spend is going to happen because they're not going to let it. But does at least this force the members of both parties to be serious about it on the floor and to actually get these bills discussed?
You would think so. I think what would have been even more effective is having an actual continuing resolution, meaning that if there weren't new appropriations in place, then things would kind of continue on as well as that small decline. But the way that they set that up, it's kind of complicated. So for non-defense discretionary, which is where a lot of there's a lot of nonsense in the federal government, and
Hmm.
that's where a lot of it lives, not all of it. It wouldn't be a reduction relative to the caps in the bill for fiscal year 2024. It would be relative to the spending level currently in place, FY23. So the 1% reduction is actually a higher amount than the caps that are in the bill. So it's really complicated. It doesn't necessarily give us the incentive to complete all the appropriations bills well on time.
Hmm.
It is an incentive to complete the appropriations bills in some form on time, which could be better or worse than the status quo.
Well, and that's the problem is that these folks, and I've found out some numbers. One of our congressmen is a Wall Street guy and not a lawyer. So it was interesting getting some of the breakdowns, and you don't see this so much, but he pointed out to us that the federal government takes in, and I actually take some positive spin out of this, that even with the way the economy is right now, and even with the inflation, and even with the gas prices, we generate $400 billion in tax collections every month, Kurt.
Mhm.
And they spend 5. So
Right.
we see the problem. Janet Yellen was masterful at sounding like that math teacher nobody wanted to get when she said, "We're gonna have a default," when really she could have just paid our bills with the 400 billion. Am I wrong, Kurt?
In terms of a technical default, she was absolutely wrong. I mean, there's plenty of revenue coming in to cover interest and principal on the debt. That is the thing that the 14th Amendment, combined with the statutory debt limit, requires. You pay the principal and interest on the debt first, and then you prioritize accordingly. Now, my understanding is that there is the technical capacity within the Treasury to prioritize certain kinds of payments for sure.
Mhm.
Principal and interest on debt, Social Security, and then it's a little questionable about how they would deal with everything else.
Right.
But at least those couple of things are totally covered. There's absolutely no reason to default. But that doesn't necessarily tell you what the investors or the financial sector might do if they saw some sort of governance crisis like that.
Well, and am I wrong or Pollyannic to say, my gosh, we're still generating this kind of tax revenue, record tax revenue, and a lot of it is pointed to the tax cuts that happened during the Trump administration. But we're still doing this, and we're still carrying around this yoke of inflation, and our gas prices are eating us up, and our home heating prices are eating us up. Our electricity bills are going up. If we could catch a break from some of that, Johnny bar the door, in my mind, Kurt. I mean, we'd be generating enough revenue to pay this all back.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason we have inflation is also part of the reason, a small part of the reason we have deficits. It's that this administration has systematically overregulated to the extent that they're able to, especially traditional, reliable forms of energy. But the inflation that we got, that is the consequence of the federal government spending and borrowing way too much. They basically forced the Federal Reserve to monetize a lot of that debt. And when the money grows a lot faster than the economy does, then you're going to have inflation. It's just a mathematical concept. So we need to get the spending and the borrowing down, and we need to grow the economy faster, and that's how we're going to beat inflation.
So how far? And I hate to say this because it's like saying to a teenager, well, if you're out later than 2 a.m., you should call your mom and dad because, yeah, but how much further can we continue to print money just based on the full faith and credit that Joe Biden's awake by, noon? And I'm being glib because I mean it's so serious. I don't know where to begin with the idea of when that dollar gets to the Weimar Republic level, where people stop using it on the world stage, when they stop spending it, when it stops being petrodollars and it starts to become petro yuan or petro rubles. We're in big trouble, and I'm considering the rancor, and I know you're not a sociologist, Kurt, but economically, we're at each other right now with pitchforks and torches, metaphorically. Here in Charlottesville, we got to be careful about saying the T word. But we are yelling and screaming at each other now. What happens if the economy cracks and splits open?
Well, it could be a lot worse than things have been so far, and that's part of the problem that we're dealing with the debt growing like it is pushing up interest rates, and that's putting pressure on everything else in the budget, which kind of amplifies all the partisan and polarizing influences of social media and lots of other things.
Mm.
But if we're going to get this under control, we do need to have better representatives in Congress and in the White House. We also need to have better systems in which they can work. The two of those together, better personnel and better systems, that's how we're going to get the better outcomes that we need.
Well, last time I checked the deed to the United States, it still says "we the people" at the top of it. Don't we have to, as a senior economic advisor for Americans for Prosperity, Kurt, don't we have to bear our weight into it? I mean, we're all looking for some grant funding. We're all patting ourselves on the back because some program has been dedicated to fund this, that, or the other thing. I mean, and this is where it all adds up to, doesn't it, Kurt?
Of course, the American people vote for the people that say they're going to give the people what they want. So part of the challenge is figuring out how to get the incentives facing Congress pointed in the right directions so that members of Congress are more able to say no to things that don't actually add value for the American people. Just to give you a small example. So in Virginia, the annual budget that the legislature does, they put everything into one bill, all
Hmm.
spending. At the federal level, only about 28% of spending is part of the annual appropriations process. That's all that's
Oh my
capped
gosh.
in
Yeah.
this debt limit deal. What
28,
about the
28%.
28%?
Oh my gosh.
What about the other 72% of spending? What about all the revenue, all the nonsense that's in the tax code?
Hmm.
They don't touch that in any sort of anticipated, like open to everyone process every year in Congress. So no wonder everything that isn't looked at every year is driving a lot of the problems we have, whether it's undermining our economic growth or, spiraling the budget deficits.
Well, is it also fair to say that we have gotten to a point where most people are almost viewing the United States, and certainly the ones in Congress, Kurt Couchman is on with us from Americans for Prosperity, senior economic fellow. It's almost as if we've come to define the United States by the money that they send us, and that our liberty is not actual liberty. It is how much money I've got. I mean, I've actually heard activists say that you without money you have no liberty, and it shakes my you know core beliefs. But that's out there. That is in a lot of communities. If the government sends you money, then you have liberty, even though it may come with strings attached that actually limit your liberty.
Well, we believe in freedom and prosperity, and the best way to get both is to empower the private sector to solve the problems that most people have. There is a proper role for government, of course. Defense is the premier one.
Hmm.
There are also some things that support a productive economy. Having a court system is a really important way of settling
Yeah,
disputes peacefully. And
rule
there's a
of
list of
law.
those
Yeah.
things. But the federal government has gone so far beyond the things that it's supposed to do and the things that it can do well, that it's gone so far beyond those core competencies that it's not doing anything well anymore, it seems
Hmm.
like.
Well, and now you've worked with many congressional staffs. I wasn't sure whether you were on several of the staffs or you were an economic advisor to some of these Congress people. But I've been told that, I mean, the negotiative process in the House is ludicrous. It's get everything you want and then figure out how to pay for it later, and that's their idea of compromise. Take us into the process of how a congressman fights this urge just to send money back to the district.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I worked for two members of the House of Representatives. I worked for Justin Amash from Michigan for 4 years, and then I worked for Dave Bratt from Virginia for 2 years.
Oh, well,
And
then I'm right now. Your bona fides are made now.
well, so here's the thing. Most members don't really get included in the negotiations. In this Congress, Speaker McCarthy and Whip Emmer and Majority Leader Scalise have been really good about trying to make sure that everyone who wants to participate are able to, but those members still aren't in the room. The negotiators were Speaker McCarthy and his
Mhm.
team, Garrett Graves from Louisiana, and Patrick McHenry from North Carolina primarily. And the rest of the members, the other 218 members of the House Republicans, they were kind of on the outside looking in a little bit,
Mhm.
and that's the way it usually goes. So we need to change the way that Congress operates because right now it's very top down. And there's a lot of members with incredible life histories, work experiences, knowledge, networks of people that they can draw on as they're engaging in the policy process, but they don't get to use those muscles in the way that they should. And therefore, the
Right.
results end up not being as good as they should be because no one person or no handful of people can do as well and apply as much knowledge as a lot more people with the right incentives, of course.
So what should the viewer be calling their congressperson about? I mean, I certainly would start with, just pick up the phone and say, stop spending so damn much, you. But I want it to be effective. I want it to be, impactful. What should the fax machines and the emails and the phone calls be saying to our members of the House when we do call them or when we do see them back in the district?
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you, I think, 4 points. One, use the appropriations process. It's only 28% of spending, but that's a lot of what people think of as the government. So try to find opportunities for savings or reducing spending on low value stuff. Second, move to adopt overall spending caps like Virginia does.
Hmm.
Right now, the spending caps, they're not even a third of spending. Let's move to spending caps that are broader. And, the one of the nice things about the deal is it just got 80% of Democrats on the record supporting spending caps. So let's build on that. Number three, let's move to a real budget like we were talking about that has everything in it. That's how you manage the whole thing and drive value. And then fourth, we need to revive the authorization process, the way that programs are developed, because there's a lot that can't be in the budget process. It's like the specifics about how these programs are designed and who operates them and how. And part of that is the REINS Act, which Congress is actually, or the House is considering this week
Hmm.
to reclaim authority over legislative powers that are currently being exercised by the administrative state in the federal agencies. And that's just an abdication that needs to be brought back.
Well, and you talk about that abdication, Kurt. I mean, we see it manifest in so many different ways, including sort of the one man, one pen, one phone way that the country is operated by whoever happens to be at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, creating this nuttiness that seems to grip us every 4 years right now, because it's almost like we're voting for a sovereign. And they're going to just send their troops out amongst us to do what seems necessary, and that needs to be reined in just from a liberty level. But the spending that they have, these folks, we don't know. Here at the Government Accountability and Oversight Group, we cut our teeth catching the EPA, Lisa Jackson, negotiating with the folks from Greenpeace in a back room using her Gmail accounts. And that's where we were born. We found these bureaucrats are just off there doing their own thing. And we all have egos. We all want to feel like we're important. And K Street lobbyists, I'm sure they are very good at negotiating that. But gosh, oh man, at least, put this back in the hands of people that every couple of years we may have a vote about, right, Kurt?
Absolutely. I mean, the point of having representatives is one, accountability. That's the number one thing, that these are people that have to answer to the people from the districts they represent.
Hmm.
I don't like to call them their districts because they don't own them, they just represent them.
Well said.
And it has to come out of the hands of people that have no accountability. I mean, part of being a representative is taking all that knowledge and applying it, but it's also being someone that can be held accountable. And right now, the president's barely held accountable. I mean, the election every 4 years, okay, but then once they become a lame duck in their second term, there's no more accountability for them. And all the officials, all of the agency staff, they never face the voters. So, like, there's not really a good mechanism to make sure that the policy that's being chosen is
Hmm.
actually in any way responsive to the needs of the American people. It really needs to shift back to Congress.
Well, is it too hard, or is it too nuanced? Is it too deep in the weeds, Kurt? And Kurt Couchman is on with us from Americans for Prosperity on the budget deal in the future, and what Newt said at the onset of the show, and Kurt echoed. If this is step one, okay. If this is it, oh, we're in trouble. But I try to make the case, and we've got roughly an hour here every afternoon, but my radio show is 4 hours long. I try to make the case, point to me an instance where all of this money has actually achieved the desired outcomes. I could even make a case that our military budget hasn't been able to do that, but certainly these social programs have not come close to achieving it. We have 4 times as many poor people as we did when the war on poverty began in 1964, Kurt. So is it too long of a march to try to explain to people that, yeah, sure, the government sent you $300, but it only buys $150 worth of stuff now?
Yeah, I mean, federal spending or government spending generally can make poverty less miserable, but a government check doesn't give you purpose in life. And that's really important. And that's what working, community service, a lot of other things provide to people. So we need to be thinking about how to empower people, how to help them break their own barriers, and how to break government imposed barriers that stand in the way of people achieving their own American dreams. That's what AFP is all about. We're working with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to find ways forward and all of that.
Mhm.
But it is going to be a marathon, not a sprint.
Well, so are there, and I know AFP has always been great. I mean, since you guys launched, what was it, '08,
Oh, four, I think.
'04? Okay. Uh, to make sure there are toolkits available for people at home to go there. So just AFP.org, correct, Kurt?
That's the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer. So you want to go to
Well, that might
Americans.
not be a bad place to go either. But
True, true. We're AmericansForProsperity.org, and we're on Twitter and Facebook and lots of other places too.
and after you download that, go to the Anglican Fellowship for Prayer and get down on your knees a little bit. You know,
Too.
and I know your former boss Kurt would probably say that's half the problem is you know, too many of us are standing up instead of kneeling down.
He probably would say something like that.
Well, Kurt, I appreciate it. Kurt Couchman, Americans for Prosperity. I appreciate your analysis. So, last little bit, prognosticate a little bit. Do you hold out hope, having worked in these halls recently enough, you know, that you and Speaker Gingrich are right that this is just first step, not last step?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful that that's the case. I've been around DC for a little while now. But the reality is you just have to keep pushing. People all throughout the country need to keep calling their members of Congress. They need to get engaged, keep the pressure on. And, you know, we're working with good offices on Capitol Hill to figure out how to fix these systemic problems. So if we have anything to say about it, and we will, there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we're going to do our part to make sure that it gets done.
Well, Kurt, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I appreciate your time, and I know it was a little short notice, but we have got a lot of plates spinning around here, so we try to move with alacrity. So I appreciate it, and thank you, sir, and have a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you so much. I know.
And thank you for everything you do tuning in. And I know that we had some issues on Friday's broadcast. We were trying to come to you from the campus of Hofstra University. The problem with Hofstra University is that it didn't have very much in the way of cell service. So internet service was also very bad, unless you were paying the tuition to go to Hofstra University. Then I'm sure you had multiple gigabits of speed. But I thought appropriate today, since the bit rates and everything we were dropping, I think we dropped 70% of the frame. So bless any of you that tuned in on Friday to watch the Constitutional. I mean, it almost looked like something from a Bugs Bunny cartoon, I'm sure. The discussion on Capitol Hill today is that Congress wants to save AM radio, just like it's saved so many other things. We were at a conference of talk radio show hosts and programmers and radio station owners, and they were all for it. I wish I could say I was all for it too, because I know what happens when the government says, hey, don't worry about anything, we'll take care of it for you. But I thought it would be apropos to bring back in our chat with Michael Harrison, the publisher of Talkers Magazine, to go into the state of talk radio, the spoken word, this afternoon. Thank you for being part of today's Afternoon Constitutional and tuning in. We are not, or are we, at Hofstra University today for Talkers Magazine's annual Talkers Conference, which is where Michael Harrison, showing that he really is a masochist, brings in all of the talk radio show hosts and all of the talk media show hosts from across the country, mixes them with station ownership and station management and network management, and then tries to ride herd on this massive sea of egos for a day at Hofstra University. And the crazy person, look at what it's done to him. He's 27 years old, and he's... He is is Michael Harrison, publisher of Talkers Magazine, the industry Bible for all things spoken word. And I think you were the first person I ever heard use the phrase the spoken word format, because it covers so many things, including milieus like this one, where for some reason people say face for radio doesn't count anymore, so go do a video show. Michael, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. And, there are two parts of my reality. This is my reality a couple of days before the conference. And as people are watching this, we're at the conference. And then because I understand, it's out there on the internet, it'll be around for millions of years beyond the conference. I feel
Mhm.
good in all of those different settings.
So talk about, talk radio pre-COVID, post-COVID. You've ridden the wave through it, pre-Trump, post-Trump. There are so many demarcation lines in the last 5 years. It's good to have a trade paper that's specifically about this format because there are lots of great trade papers for radio in general and broadcasting in general, but specifically to talk to the people who are in the conversation business. This has been had to have been an incredible time. How do you fit everything into a magazine?
Well, it's interesting. Thank you for referring to us as a paper and a magazine because we are, at least philosophically,
Yeah.
a paper and a magazine. We are at this point completely digital. And the media theory behind forming content and when does a movie become a video and when does a video become a movie and when does a newspaper become a news organization and when is a radio station audio as opposed to audio and video. These are things I've always been obsessed with throughout my career. As a result, it launched a sideline as a trade publisher because I was obsessed with categorizing things, categorizing music formats, categorizing songs, categorizing different formats within talk. Because if you don't define these things, which are, by the way, constantly evolving, you
Hmm.
wind up out of touch with reality. So that's sort of the whole thing about trade papers
Hmm.
and things of that nature. I've been publishing talkers for 33 years, and
No. Oh my.
right, 1990. So it's going to be 34 years,
My goodness.
right around the time of the convention. Yeah, we started publishing it in the summer of 1990. And during that time, there has never been a period where we said, well, things are slowing down, the world is becoming dull. Um, we always thought that the times we were in, whether it was the 1992 election,
Hmm.
whether it was the various wars in the Middle East, the whole 2000 hanging Chads thing,
Sure.
the pandemic. I mean, I can go on and on and on. And then even before talkers, I mean, there was once a thing called the O.J. Simpson trial. There has never been a time in the talk media when it was boring, slow,
Hmm.
passe.
Hmm.
Um, this format will never be passe. We just have to figure out what we're broadcasting on,
Well,
whether
yeah,
it's
I
radio
think
or television or whatever. Yeah.
and I know you get this, and John Michael has had the colossal misjudgment to invite me to be a
So who is
panelist.
John? So who is John? This is the second time you've called me John.
It's,
Who's John Harrison? Is he like your
John,
car dealer?
it's John 314. It's the guy at the football game. So there's John 314. Now, I'm sorry. We were talking about, to be fair, we were talking about John Castamatidis, who, if you lived in the New York area, he founded a grocery store chain called Gristides. And it was just classically a New York grocery store. And now is the rarest of all birds. He's an independent owner of a radio station in the largest city in America, which honest to goodness, John, just to pick up an eddy that I wanted for later in the show, but we'll do it now. I never thought I was going to see the day where independent owners returned to major metropolitan areas. Now, I know John is a force of nature in his own right, but that's a good sign, isn't it, for conversation?
A good sign how that somebody was able to buy a radio station and run it independently
Well,
at this
that,
point
that
in
it
time.
isn't centralized. I look at so many things, and as I peel the onions back, I see centralization of retail, centralization of publication, centralization of news distribution, and I feel like it does a disservice where the independent can say, "Hey, you want to do 4 hours? You have something interesting to talk about, or some interesting people, an interesting angle. Go ahead, let's see what happens."
I understand what you're saying, and it is nice to be able to see something other than just bean counters and Wall Street obsessed business people running radio stations, which is a real funky art form.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter how you look at it, radio is a grassroots kind of streety, cutting edge language of the people, music of the people, whatever it is,
Yeah.
type of thing. So when you have a bunch of accountants running it or bean counters, it's not so good.
Right.
I with all respect to John Catsimatidis, who I think is a great guy and I think he's doing a good job, it troubles me as much when a billionaire like John, or, and not in his case, but say Elon Musk, can write out a check and buy Twitter for just a pittance to his sensibilities, and have to go through fewer hoops to do so than if you and I wanted to buy an AM radio station. We'd have to go through more hoops in terms of the FCC and licensing and all of that. So there still is kind of an imbalance in this country in terms of who is controlling the media and what does it take to have control of the media and what accountability comes with that. So, you know, when I see a guy like Bezos owning the Washington, Post, there's imbalances on both sides of that equation.
Sure.
Follow my drift.
Oh no, absolutely, I agree with you on that. And this is that actually opens up another side question, because I was just reading that Odyssey, which I used to work for when it was called all of a sudden I'm spacing Entercom Media, actually owned by Wall Street investment bean counters, is about to get, or is in danger of being delisted by the New York Stock Exchange because their stock price, I kid you not, is 9 cents per share. And they're trying to come up with a way to fix this. Now, this is a media, John, Michael, this is a media that you know very well is the cockroach of all media. It survives every onslaught. Every time something new that comes along that's going to change the media paradigm, radio is still there. Radio has portability. Radio has immediacy. Radio has person-to-person individual contact that none of the other media had. How is it these big corporations like iHeart and Odyssey and Cumulus seem to be constantly in bankruptcy courts and watching their stock values go down into less than a dime? How can they not be profitable with this industry that is so volatile and so, as far as I can see in numbers, still chugging along as popular as it has ever been?
The reason this has happened to these major companies has nothing to do, or little to do in some cases, with the actual executives running them today. They inherited this from the egomaniacal executives that came before them during the pumping up of the consolidation era, when Wall Street fell in love with radio, and you can get money if you bought radio. And when you can get easy money, prices go up. That's part of how the economy works. Happens in real estate, happens in just every sector. And that's what happened. So after deregulation, there was easy money, and radio stations began to consolidate under larger and larger corporate umbrellas. And a lot of the captains of industry who were behind that were very egotistical, and they weren't stopping and thinking about the long-term implications of paying exorbitant amounts of money for radio stations. They were just thinking about, wow, I'm now in control of 50 stations, 100 stations, 200 stations, 500 stations. And then when toward the first decade, toward the 2008, 2009, the you-know-what hit the fan, the radio station values came down. So the answer to your question is the reason they're constantly dealing with debt, cutbacks, and that expression, kicking the can down the road, where the main business that they're in is trying to come up with more investment capital, keeping the stockholders happy, answering to the board of directors, flipping it over for another cycle of investment. That's the business they're in. The business they're not in is, coming up with new creative ideas to get, listeners, and to discover new music and maybe make the country a better place, and all kinds of things that are part of the emotional side of media. They can't afford to do radio. So that's the answer to your question.
Well, then, and now watch me do this. I'm going to connect part one to part two, and here comes John again. So, a guy like John Catsimatidis certainly is a billionaire multiple times over, and he's able to buy WABC, one of the legendary stations in the United States, for rock and roll, and then for news and talk. It gave us Cousin Brucey and Rush Limbaugh. But down the pike, my group of radio stations are two rescues. We call them rescues because, like the puppy that you find at the Hound, we were abandoned by, in my flagship station, Clear Channel at the time, iHeartMedia, and then Cumulus. And we were able to buy these stations for pennies. As a matter of fact, I think the group of stations we own in Roanoke, in the Blacksburg area, cost less than my house, John. So is this financial trouble that the Odyssey's having good news for radio in the fact that people like you and me, hoops notwithstanding, can start to scratch together enough cash to buy a group of radio stations, even if it's in a bankruptcy filing?
The issue is that radio is expensive to operate, even if you don't pay a lot for it. It costs a lot of money to run those big towers and those transmitters and all the legal hoops you have to jump through with FCC attorneys and insurance and equipment and salaries. Running radio is an expensive proposition, even if you don't have a terrible debt service. And as wonderful as radio is, as you and I have discussed earlier in this conversation, it's still really tough out there to sell advertising and to generate revenue because of a number of obstacles facing radio. One of them is all of this exotic technological competition. Two, much of that competition is unregulated by the government. There's a democratized, easy entrance without gatekeepers. So you're competing against people who have a bigger signal than you do and are not regulated. And startups are everywhere. So those are two problems. And then there is a tremendous generation divide where younger people were not raised on radio the way our generation was. They certainly don't know what AM is, and they hardly know what FM is. And music has a whole different place in the culture. Music discovery and the radio being the place that set the tone for the culture has been lost. So there are a number of reasons why. Not to mention controversy, and a lot of people don't want to advertise on talk radio because they think it's hateful, no matter what side of the discussion they're on. They think the other side is hateful, and the other side is going to destroy democracy. Either side destroy democracy. So there are obstacles to running a radio station, even if you got it for free.
But and anyone watching this right now, and John was talking about, starting a program like this. But this is with the blessing of the radio station ownership saying, hey, people trust being able to see some things, and maybe doing some of the stuff in video space is good. John and I are not both. Michael and I are both not auditioning for the role of the Big Lebowski in the off-Broadway play. We are both longtime rock and rollers. We started in rock and roll radio. And you talked about the music connection, but I'm going to bring it to talking, to the talk format, the spoken word format, Michael, and talk about the other end of it. You're talking about the business end and how expensive it is, but the listeners, the consumers of our product. I've worked in a bunch of different music formats and then the spoken word, and only one format has approached the zeal and passion that rock radio has for its station. That's my station. Is talk radio. And the listener is so passionate, and all you have to do is casually say, hey, support our sponsors, and 10 of them will walk into a store. I had somebody buy $1,000 cashmere overcoat because I said, hey, by the way, theirs is 10% and everyone else is 1%. The intimacy and that personal touch that talk radio has, Michael, that's got to be worth something. That's got to be some kind of currency, don't you think?
It's worth a lot. That's what makes radio when it's operated that way, a very good buy. Now, without sounding like I'm blowing my own horn, you'll notice there's a connection between rock radio of the day when rock radio was the shining light of a culture, not just a utilitarian audio device, and talk radio, and that is I was running the trade publication at the time in terms of publishing or editing that dealt with that whole rise of FM rock and album rock and progressive rock. A lot of the listeners that were listening to that hippy dippy radio back in the 70s and early 80s are conservative news talk radio listeners today. They bring that same love of the medium and the platform to their daily lives. It has to do with trust. It has to do with engaging an audience, with reaching out through those speakers in the here and the now, and giving them products, whether it's music or subject matter that they relate to, that ties into their hearts as well as their heads, and that makes them feel that they're part of a community. And that's why it works so well. That's also why one of the most expensive aspects of if you buy radio advertising is called the personal host endorsement. When you actually get the host to do a live spot read and say, not only do I think that, not only am I bringing you the message that Joe's Diner is the best place to get ham and eggs here in Charlottesville, but I go there every morning and I love the place.
Oh,
yeah. You can't say that if it's against the law. It's actually against the law for you to go on the air and say, I buy all of my snow removal equipment. And, so
that's right.
You've got to prove that you do it.
And we've seen some cases where people in the sports realm of the spoken word format have gotten in small modicums of trouble in ticket brokering and things like that. I see our producer has now fixed the graphics on the screen to remind me that it's not John Harrison, it's Michael. So
I'm thinking of changing my name.
Sound like a member of the Beatles. Now you are a member of a musical group, and you scratched that itch with some popular hit songs amongst the talk radio milieu there. How is your band going, John? Michael?
I normally would be insulted, but you and I've only known each other for
forever.
Years.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we're losing our marbles. You can't remember my name, and I don't seem to care. I don't know whether you're mortified or you're just easy on yourself.
It's just at the end of a long day, there's a lot of effluent that has come through the pipe, and it's just all kind of building up on the catch screen at some point. And it's, and if you can't have fun, I learned this from my daughter. If you can't have fun at dad's expense, who can you have fun at? So,
exactly. And this whole conversation is just a big dad joke anyway, so don't worry about it. Now, in all seriousness, I'm glad you brought it up. I am a member of the classic rock band Gun Hill Road. I used to play them regularly. Every day I was one of their champions back in the days when DJs played what they wanted to. And they were they weren't local, they were a national group based out of New York. And I became friendly with them back, we're talking 1971 on WNEW-FM. And I've remained friends with these guys all these years and followed their lives, and they've gone off in different fields of entertainment and music and whatever, but they always kept coming back together and continue to make music. Make a long story short, I became a member of the band, and it's not my band, it's their band. I'm honored to be in that band, and it's at this point in my life, at this stage in my life, to have been a member of this band for the last 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it's been, is just like cool. What can I say? I'm an old guy who still enjoys being cool, and if being in an old band is cool. But we have a record out called Idiots, and I know you've heard it. You might have played it.
We've played it. No, we have played it. That's it. And it's fun, and you guys are having fun, and that's the thing. As we wrap up, and of course I'm actually participating in Talkers, the conference this year. At this point in time of the afternoon, I think I'm just sitting in the audience scribbling notes feverishly, which is how I've learned most of the things I've learned, whether it's from the technology people that Michael brings together and teaches you you little hacks and things like that, so you can do all these magnificent things easily. But I appreciate your time. I want to bring it back to the listener viewer for a second. Is there some, because of the passion of the consumer of the spoken word format, Michael, should a listener, a real fan of talk radio, subscribe to Talkers Magazine, or is this really just for guys like me who are scared to death that they're going to catch on that I'm only popular because I was playing, Matchbox 20 back in the day?
Well, Talkers is designed for people in the business. It's not designed for consumers. However, if a consumer is so interested in a field that they want to know what's going on in it and behind the scenes, and here in the interactive age that we live in, where the audiences and the fans have power over what's going on. Think about the poor producers of Star Trek or Jeopardy. Every day they have to deal with the fans and what they want. Then Talkers is a great place to subscribe. The point is, I'm not here to sell it because it's free. So it's not like it costs any money. Talkers.com is where everything that's in Talkers is. It's absolutely free, and there's a daily newsletter that we send out to anybody who wants it, and they can find that on the website. I appreciate your mentioning it, but it's out there, but it's not designed. We don't say, oh, those Democrats are terrible, or oh, those Republicans are ruining life. We don't get into any of that. It's all about media and media theory.
I say that all the time. As a matter of fact, I say both things all the time, Michael, and I appreciate, and moreover, and I probably never said this because you're always busy, and I don't want to sound like that guy, but when the last time I was spinning records, and I still do call them records. So while I call yours a newspaper or a magazine, I still call them records. I just talked to Robin Taylor Zander the other day, the son of Robin Zander, who's 30. So the founder of Cheap Trick's son is 30 and releasing his first record. I want to say this because you were an invaluable source of encouragement and counsel when I had to figure out whether I would still be popular if I couldn't duck behind 10 in a row at some point. And I appreciate that every day and all the days. And that's why whatever I can do to help Talkers and the continued health of the industry, I'm there for it, for you, your family, and everyone else. But I don't think I've ever said that to you, whether in a public milieu or not. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
That's very kind of you. I appreciate it greatly. And you contribute to our scene every day that you're out there, both as a programmer and as a personality on the radio. And you're, as the cliche is, you're living the dream. I mean, you're doing it, and you're doing it with passion and with concern. So on that note, I thank you very much, Joe.
Well, and I want to thank you for watching. And, I still smell the pepper spray, so sometimes doing it isn't so much fun. But I appreciate you being on the receiving end of this. I'm going to go back to the conference, talkers.com. If you're curious about talk radio, if you love it so much you just want to read more about it. And we will see you back here Monday afternoon at 3 or at 5 a.m. for the radio broadcast. Until then, so long, and thanks for all the fish.